Hi, welcome to Grafted, Jewish Roots of Christianity. I'm your host, Stephanie Pavlantos. Today, I have Abigail Van Huss. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So Abigail, I'll tell you a little bit about her. She is an archaeologist. She is the assistant dig director for the Shiloh excavations for the Associates for Biblical Research. She has been involved with archaeology since 2007, working at different archaeological projects, including the Temple Mount Salvage Operation. She has co-authored 2 articles on the subject of the Judean pillar figurines. She has her master's degree. She also has working on her PhD and she can explain all of that, what she's working in and the things she has discovered and is writing about. But thank you for being here. And I know we have a great conversation. You also, just to let people know, she has a blog, and I will leave links to her blog and to her YouTube channel. You are recently married, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And so I think you and your husband do the YouTube channel, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a joint YouTube channel.
Yeah, so that's fun. And I think I saw your wedding on the channel.
Yes.
Where did you get married?
We got married at Shiloh. It was at our dig site. The boss gave us the morning off. Well, he actually gave us the whole day off. That was special, but he gave everybody else off enough time to attend our wedding, and then he made them get back to work. So it was great fun. We had a sunrise wedding first thing in the morning while everybody was still clean before they started digging and got all dirty.
Yeah. How fun. That's so cool.
Mm-hmm.
I saw where you had the shofar was blown before you came out. That was beautiful.
We did. We have a team member who blows the shofar, and we asked him, will you do that at our wedding? And he was honored. So yeah, that was great. That was really special.
Well, definitely ranks up there with just interesting places to get married. So that's pretty cool. So tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself, whatever you'd like to include.
Yeah, so I'm from Idaho, and when I was a young adult, I thought I would go to Israel. I went on a tour, and I thought that was pretty cool, so I went back on a volunteer work trip, and that was when I was introduced to archaeology, because our group stopped at the Temple Mount Salvage Operation, and they take groups. You can just come and sift for a couple hours. This is material that was bulldozed out from the Temple Mount when they were doing renovations on the mosque there, and so they have just piles of rubble from the Temple Mount that they're sifting through. And so we went and we sifted, and I told my group leader when it was time to go, I was like, you just leave me here. Like, you guys go on, I'll stay. And he was like, no, you have to come with us. So I had to go back to Israel again just to volunteer on that project for a couple of weeks. And then after that, I started volunteering on digs. And I just love that. And so I did that for a number of years, just every year going on a dig. And then I finally thought, I really like this. I'm going to go back to school. So I've been a student, and I completed my master's degree in biblical history and archaeology at the Bible Seminary. And the topic of my dissertation was Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal. And because there's been a structure excavated there, and the question is it or isn't it? And so that's what I addressed in my master's thesis. And now I'm working on my PhD at Ariel University in Israel, and I'm studying the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age in the Central Hill Country of Israel. And basically what that is looking at the transition from Canaanite culture there to Israelite culture with the arrival of the Israelites in the land after the Exodus.
Okay. Yeah, we talked a little bit about some of this, and it's very interesting. So I'm going to let her elaborate as we go on about some of the topics that we've already picked through. But yeah, so it's interesting. We talked about the order in which you did it, because a lot of people do the book learning first, and then they go on if you want to call them internships or whatever you want to say that is. But yeah, so you did it the opposite. But I think that's pretty cool too, because you you kind of saw the dirty side, and I guess you wouldn't even call it the dirty side as far as like it's a fun kind of dirty.
It is my
But
favorite
getting
part, getting in the dirt and digging. But yeah, no, it was good because I knew that I loved it. Because we've had people that like are several years into a degree program and then they finally come on a dig and they're like, I can't stand getting dirt under my fingernails. I hate this. And so for me, it's like I already knew I loved it. And so that was good.
Yeah. That just reminds me of a funny story. My husband and I are gardeners, and we have a big garden and stuff. And somebody who we knew asked if they could plant a few things in our garden, and we're like, sure. But then I find out that she hates getting her hands dirty. I mean, literally hates. I'm like, well, why did you want to like plant in our garden then? Because it requires you getting your hands a little dirty. But yeah, it's funny. And I'm not one, because we have livestock and stuff. So nice manicured nails is not a thing I do.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of women do. And so, yeah, to get their hands dirty, get their nails dirty, I'm sure. Like, oh no, I can't do that. I'm going to break a nail. But totally understand. But it's just funny when it happens and you hear it, especially when it's something you love so much. And it's like, they wash. And you talk on your website a little bit about some of your adventures too. And I did see some pictures. You had some cool pictures and stuff. And like you said, you even got married at the site in Shiloh. So that's really cool. I think a person loves what they do when you see what do they take pictures of, and where do they choose to spend their honeymoon. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your master's and your thesis for that, because we're actually gonna go back to the Bible in Joshua, so you can look up some of the things she's talking about. But very, very interesting subject there.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
So in Deuteronomy, Moses receives instructions from God that when the Israelites come into the promised land, and as soon as they gain a foothold there, they're to go to Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, which are opposite each other. Shechem is in the valley between them. And they're to do this ceremony of blessings and cursings. And half of the tribes are going to stand on Mount Gerizim, and they're going to pronounce blessings, and half will stand on Mount Ebal and pronounce cursings. And then they're to build an altar and sacrifice there on Mount Ebal. So we know about this ceremony. We know, and in my view, this is basically the founding of their new nation. And they are basically electing God as their king. And they're saying, we understand the terms of this agreement. We understand the blessings that you'll send us if we obey you. We understand the curses that will befall us if we disobey. And so it's this big covenant ceremony. And then they build this altar and they sacrifice. But for centuries, explorers, like all the explorers, wanted to come to Israel and find all the places where things happened. They couldn't find the altar on Mount Ebal. They looked for it. They assumed that it would be on the side facing Mount Gerizim because that's where the ceremony is happening. And there just isn't anything there. But in the 1980s, an Israeli archaeologist, he was a secular archaeologist, didn't care about biblical things necessarily. He was just doing a survey of Mount Ebal, looking for every single archaeological site there from any time period. And he found this site from the early Iron Age, and that's the early Israelite period. And it's this big structure that is not a house, it's not a tower, and it's full of animal bones and ash. Bones of sheep, goats, cows, and a few deer bones. But and he became convinced that Joshua was real, that Joshua really built an altar, and he believed that this was Joshua's altar that he had found. And he got a lot of pushback from other secular archaeologists who disagreed. They were like, no, it can't be an altar. It must be a house. It must be a tower, something like that. But he went to his grave believing that he had found Joshua's altar.
Wow.
But since he passed away, not a lot has been done. And so I went back because although I suspected that he was right that he had found Joshua's altar, it actually dated to a little bit later than when I believe Joshua was there. And so that was the focus of my research, was to see what was going on there, because he found this altar that's really been the focus of what people know about the site. But underneath it, in an earlier phase, there was a smaller round altar, and not a lot of people had talked about that. He documented it, it was there, and so I did a lot of research. I looked at the pottery from the site, analyzed the time period of that pottery, and I concluded that that earlier round structure probably is Joshua's altar. It dates to the right time period. It seems to be right. And then later on, the Israelites probably came back and they commemorated the site by building the large rectangular structure over top of it to protect it, preserve it. And then they filled that structure with ashes and bones from the original sacrifices at the site, because it was filled while they were building it, which means those weren't sacrifices from the big altar. Those were sacrifices that predated it. And so they built this large rectangular altar, and I don't even know if they sacrificed on that or if it was just a memorial,
right,
just to remember that site. And then eventually the whole site was covered over with stones. It was a respectful burial of the site. And this is something that we see at other religious sites from the time in that region, is one of two things happens. Either it's buried respectfully, like it's abandoned, they're done with it, but they want to respect it, or it's destroyed when someone else comes in. And we see this like with religious reforms. Hezekiah went out and destroyed a bunch of pagan altars, right? So those are the two things that happen to altars and temples, is either they're abandoned and respectfully buried, or they're destroyed by someone else coming in.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense when you go through Chronicles, especially Second Chronicles, and all the kings and the kings who listened to God and obeyed God, and those who rebelled against him. But the ones, there was some who destroyed everything that was all the high places and all of that.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. And so that makes a lot of sense that you would find the ruins of those kinds of things.
Right, yeah.
So if not the whole structure, because like you said, when I went to Israel, we went to, oh my goodness, it was where the baths are, where the man who Jesus healed would have wanted to get into the water.
Oh yeah, the pools of Bethesda.
Yes, Bethesda. Thank you. I've forgotten where it was, but yeah. So, but they were uncovering those kinds of sites and the, I don't know, pools, I guess is the word.
Right. Yeah, they've uncovered the pools. And then they also uncovered was a Byzantine era church built there to commemorate that site, because in the Byzantine era, they knew that this was the place, or at least they thought so, and I think they were right. And so we often see that Byzantine era churches built on the biblical sites.
Okay. Yeah. And that makes sense, because I mean, I had someone on my podcast who was actually a tour guide. She's an Israeli. She was a tour guide for Christians. And she talked about it. She goes, there's just the accepted site, because maybe they couldn't get to the real site. So they would build a memorial somewhere.
Yeah, and that happened too. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of what we visit when we go to Israel is the memorial for that site. Because that site is either hasn't been revealed, or they're not 100% sure where it is. So
yeah, so you do have to be careful, because sometimes they got it right and built, right on the site, and like that marks the spot. And then other times they didn't know or couldn't access it. And so you have to be careful being like, oh, this must be the spot because the Byzantines knew. It can be, but it's not always.
I heard people taking stones, trying to take them to the airport out of Israel, because somebody told them Jesus walked on these stones, and so they wanted to take them. So it is, not everybody knows that for 100%, but there were some places that were actually blocked off because they were reshoring the steps or the stairways and whatever. And so when we were there, they were blocked off and you couldn't get to them. But at that time, they told us that they had blocked them off because people were stealing the stones.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, so that is. And so you kind of take away from a historical site that everybody could enjoy
Mm-hmm.
and get something from. But yeah, so anyway, one of the things I thought of when you were talking about that was, I have no idea what the process is for you to do like your research in that area
Mm-hmm.
to find Jake. I keep wanting to say Jacob, so I'm sorry, but
Mm-hmm.
Joshua's
Mm-hmm.
altar. What is the process you have to go through to get to be able to do that?
Yeah. So, well, in my case, I was studying what had already been excavated, but yeah, if you're going to excavate a site, so like for example, we dig at Shiloh, and so one of the first things we have to do is get a permit, and so and it depends, where you are, what government you're going to talk to, but in Israel, you talk to the Israeli Antiquities Authority. And you have to present a proposal. This is what we want to do. This is what we hope to find. This is our budget. And you kind of have to prove that, you want to do it and you're capable of doing it, and that you're going to publish your findings at the end, because that's important. Archaeology is destructive. So if you dig everything up and then you don't publish it, it's lost and gone forever. You might still have the finds, the things that you found, but nobody knows where they came from or what. And it's all about the stratigraphy, what layer they came from. So you have to document that so carefully.
Yeah.
So we go and dig, and then anything that we find belongs to the Israeli government. Okay. So we take what we find at the end of each dig season, we turn it in, and then from that point we can borrow it back again when we want to do research on it. We can go in and look at it. We can even get a permit to take it and get it tested, get it studied. Okay. But eventually it all ends up in the government warehouses. That's where it lives. But we're the ones who have to study it and then publish our findings.
Mm-hmm. And a tell is an area that is being excavated, or where they know they have layers of civilizations. How would you? I mean, I know it's a term that you would use, like Tel Aviv, and that word Tel. It's an archaeological term.
So there's two main types of archaeological sites, and Tel is one of them, and that's where you're driving and you see a mound, and you might think it's just a natural hill, but if you've kind of trained your eye, you recognize them. And and how they're formed is usually, because you wonder, like, how does it get up like that? Like, you would think if a city was destroyed, they'd kind of clear it and start from the bottom.
I know.
But they don't always, because like those are big building stones. It's not like, I don't know, in the US we build houses out of wood, and they're just like, if they burn, they're gone. Like you have those stones, and so they, if something happens, there's a destruction, they kind of just level it off and build on top of it. And then the thing that made most of the tells form, though, was in the Middle Bronze Age. This is the Canaanite period, a little bit after Abraham. What happened is they were building their cities. They figured out they needed a defensive wall because people would come in and conquer them. So they built defensive walls, but then battering rams were invented. And people could knock over those walls. And so what they did is, because their cities were already starting to build up a little bit, layer on layer, they built a defensive wall. They brought in a bunch of dirt and they filled it. They packed it up. So now they have this solid thing standing. And then they built their city and a higher defensive wall up on top of that. And that effectively preserved every layer underneath that. And then from there, it just kept going up. Yeah. And so that's how we get a tell. Now, the other type of archaeological site is a khirbet. And that's a ruin. That's where there's maybe one phase of occupation. That's it. And then it got knocked down. And yes, there's ruins, but you're not going to find all those layers. So,
and I know, like, I think it was Bethesda is where, if I'm remembering correctly, they showed you the layers. Like, here's at the time of Jesus, here's Roman occupancy or somebody else that came in, and then, so it was very interesting. You could see the layers because they preserved the layers. And you're literally looking down on this, so you can see that the level was much lower at that time. It was way down there. Yeah, it's much lower, like sea level, and then, but that was really interesting because you're standing way high up looking down into some of these things.
Right. Yeah. It's pretty incredible. the amount of buildup you can get over a few thousand years.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It's some of the sites they've excavated so far down. I think of Megiddo that has, I don't know, maybe, am I thinking 30? I could be wrong, but something like that. Layers, just layer upon layer, and it's so deep. Civilization upon civilization. If it's a good place to build a city, if it's near water, if it's near a trade route, if it's near good farmland, people are going to keep living there over and over again.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. But it's amazing what they did without bulldozers and all sorts of big equipment that we have today.
I know.
That they were able to just bury. It's like, how do you bury a whole town, a whole city?
Lots
like that.
Lots of labor. Lots of people working.
Slave labor.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. You had mentioned that there were remains or what looked like a tabernacle or maybe a temple that was there. So what is your main work in Shiloh that you are doing?
So we're digging on the northern slopes of the site, and this is a well-known site. It's been excavated in the past. Parts of it have been excavated in the past, and so by different teams. So we kind of know what to expect, but we had a section on the northern side that nobody had excavated before, and so that's kind of our place. And as we were digging, we started finding this structure. We're calling it a monumental structure. It's too big to be a house. It's something. It's some public building. Something. And so as we're digging and we're coming down, we discovered that it has an arrangement. It runs east to west, and it's arranged in a 2/3, 1/3 division. So it's 3 times as long as it is wide, and it has this dividing wall. Now that's the layout of the tabernacle or the temple. You have the holy place and the holy of holies. And so that kind of caught our attention. We read in the Bible that the Israelites pitched the tabernacle, the tent, there at Shiloh, and there's been a lot of debate about where that was. Was it on the summit? Was it on the northern platform? But you're not going to find remains of a tent. It's, it just doesn't leave remains. But there's a little bit of thought that maybe, because the tabernacle was there for over 300 years, it was a long span, and there's some thought that they actually built a permanent structure there. When you read, from the time of Eli, and it describes where he is, there's some description that matches a permanent structure, like a stone structure, more so than a tent. It talks about like the doorposts. And then in Jewish writings, and these are from a later period, we don't know if they knew what was going on at Shiloh, but they describe that what they did at Shiloh was they built permanent walls and they pitched the tent as the roof of it. So we do have that, again, a much later writing, but possibly referring to what we're finding. We don't know. We're not saying that we've found the tabernacle. We're kind of excited. We hope that that's what we found, but we've got to keep digging. We've got to get the floor level and see what we find on the floor there. But the really cool thing is that if you go kind of out the front door of the structure to the edge of the site, we're uncovering, it's called a favisa. This is a religious kind of burial, but it's bones. It's sheep, goats, cows, and then other things that relate to offerings like whole bowls that are broken. If you brought a grain offering, you'd bring a bowl full of grain, but the bowl is part of the offering, so you don't keep it anymore. So you break it. You've given it to God. Nobody can use it. It's for God, kind of thing. So we see this whole deposit that's clearly a sacrificial deposit, and that's something that's really cool. There is some question because a previous Israeli excavator, he found part of it, and he thought that it was Canaanite. He thought it was too early to be Israelite. But what we're finding is that it is a little later than he thought, and so we believe that it's Israelite. And again, it's one of those things, we're in the process. We've got to keep digging and see what we find, but we're excited about that too. It's all the Israelite sacrificial animals, the sheep, the goats, the cows, young animals. So it's pretty exciting.
All the clean animals that they would have sacrificed those to other cultures. So, and And you mentioned to me, and I would have to go back and look, but you found places where you found human remains, women and children.
Yeah, so that's a different site I worked at. That's Khirbet el Maqatir, and this is a later period. This is after the time of Jesus.
That's right.
The Jewish people living there revolted against Rome. And if you'll remember from reading the Gospels, everybody kind of hoped that Jesus was going to be the leader who would revolt against Rome, right? But he didn't. And so that kind of disappointed people. And so eventually the Jewish people rebelled. They revolted against Rome, and Rome sent in several legions to come and kind of squelch this rebellion. And this site is called Khirbet el Maqatir. We believe that at this time it was called Ephraim, and we actually read, I think it's in John 6, that Jesus went to Ephraim for a little while. So Jesus may have been at this site, but this is about 40 years later. This is in 69 AD. The Romans arrived at this site, and what the Israelite people had done to prepare is they had built a strong defensive tower, and they had dug caves, and so they hid their women and children in these caves, and we assume the men went out to fight, but the Romans were too much for them. They came in, killed everybody. They found the hiding caves, killed everybody there, and so that's what we excavated, and we found destruction in there. We found Roman weapons and hobnails and the bones of these women and children, which was really sad when you think about that they were slaughtered and just left lying there for 2,000 years almost.
Yeah.
And so it was really special. We were able to, I mean, we're coming at this from a scientific viewpoint, like we want to find out what happened. But once we'd had the bones analyzed and we were done with them, what we did is we gave them to a neighboring Jewish community, and they buried them in their cemetery and put up a monument to them. And they felt that this was something really special, that these were ancestors of theirs. These were Jewish people who had never had a proper burial, and they had the honor of burying these people. And so that was a really special thing that we were able to be involved in.
Yeah, that was, I mean, I can only imagine, it's one thing finding animals, finding bones of animals, but when you come across them, it's like, oh, that's a human skull. I imagine that's like, that stops you in your tracks.
Yeah.
And everyone will come and find out what we're looking at there. So that's amazing, though.
Yeah.
That's a really cool story. And we had talked a little bit about that before we recorded, about the different revolts. And I'm a researcher, a book researcher. So, and we've talked about different opinions, you and I, before we recorded, about like Tim Mahoney and different people and their opinions. But Joel Richardson also writes a lot about some of these revolts.
Okay.
And that it was, and he actually says that when the Roman emperors were trying to squash those revolts, they actually brought in, like you said, different people, different armies that they had from all over. And some of them were like nothing more than mercenaries. They were Middle Eastern men who came in, like very willing to kill off the Jews, because they already were hated by these countries. And countries like we would think of would be Muslim countries now. But yeah, so that was an interesting point of view that he shared. And I guess he takes lots of trips out there too, but I don't think he's an archaeologist as much as he is an author and researcher. But interesting points of views that you can, when you're willing to dig and read. Especially, we talked about the importance of just even learning other people's opinions, not necessarily the one you hold on to, but it's important to be teachable and entertain, at least, that it could be this way. And you had mentioned that, it's a matter of just keep digging and you'll find.
Yeah, because if we're all trying to figure out the truth, what really happened, and different people are going down different avenues to try to figure it out, eventually somebody's going to figure out, there's going to be more evidence that comes to light. And as long as we're not like dogmatic, like my view's right, nobody else is, I can't possibly be wrong. if you are like, because this is the past, we have bits and pieces of it.
Mhm.
We don't, have a whole clear picture. So I think there is room for flexibility and understanding that, like, the trail I'm following might not be right. I might end up changing to a different view if more evidence comes to light. And somebody else might change to my view if more evidence comes to light supporting mine. And that way we got kind of feelers out going different directions, trying to figure out what really did happen.
Yeah, and I think the way you put that is really good, because some of those trails might intersect each other eventually.
Sure,
And it's like,
yeah.
oh, this is where they come together, and
Yeah.
now it makes more sense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and I think that, and I know that I've asked you the question, just like, how has the archaeology, the digs you've been on, the things that you've researched, and how has it affected how you read the Bible, how you understand the Bible, and the different, what we call stories of the Old Testament, but these were all real people, these were all real events in their lives, and but how has it affected you in your faith, I guess, would be the better question.
I think one thing that archaeology can't really do is, like, give you faith. Like, because faith is, you have faith whether or not you have evidence, right? But if it really happened, and it did, there is evidence of that. So it can encourage your faith, that you have faith, but when you see the archaeological evidence, you know, like, okay, my faith is in something real. Like, I believed it, but there's also evidence, and that's nice. And so, but beyond that, what it does for me is it makes the Bible come alive, because there are things that I just gloss over when I'm reading if I don't understand the material culture. And so you're reading and you don't understand a phrase or something. You maybe think of something in your mind that, oh, maybe this is what it means, but you kind of gloss over it. And when you understand the material culture, then it can just come to life. And I like the example that I mentioned to you earlier of the phrase when they're talking about burying somebody and he was gathered to his fathers.
Yeah.
We maybe think, oh, he went to heaven and he joined his fathers. And, there's some, more spiritual truth there maybe, but when it's talking about it in the Old Testament context, what it's talking about is a family tomb where there's a bench, and you lay the dead body out on the bench and it decomposes. And later on you come back and all that's left is bones, and you gather up the bones, and there's a pit, a repository pit, and you drop this person's bones onto the bones of his father and his grandfather and whoever else in the family was buried in that tomb. And so he is quite literally gathered to his fathers. And so when I read that in the Bible now, like, I know what it's talking about. I can picture the tomb in my head. And I understand this concept of a family tomb and being gathered to your fathers. And it's just, and there's so many of those little things that just start popping out at you when you understand, when you've researched, when you've dug, when you've found the things that belonged to the people in the Bible. Sometimes you just understand the context in which the Bible's set.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that actually, even when you shared that story, I was like, oh wow, that does make a lot of sense now. I understand that on a level I didn't before. And but the thing that just came to me when you were talking about that is a story where someone, and I can't remember the person, but they fell on Elijah's bones and they were brought back to life, right? Or
yes, you're right. It was, what was it? The enemy was coming. They were doing a funeral, but the enemy was coming, and they were like, just quick shove him in this tomb. And they put him on Elijah's bones, and he came back to life. And so yeah, that's the same type of tomb, where the bones are in there. And yeah,
that's really cool. Because, so, and he could have been in there with his own family's bones as well. And
right, who knows who else was buried there, but
because they use some of these sites, like we hear with Abraham buried Sarah, and then they went back and buried Abraham there, and then I'm sure,
and that was enough. That family tomb was strong enough of a pull that they brought Jacob. He died in Egypt, and they brought him all the way back to bury him there. So the family tomb was an important thing.
And then Joseph asked them to bring his bones back.
Yes, but he was buried in Shechem.
Okay.
We don't know why. He didn't end up in the family tomb.
Okay.
He was buried in Shechem, probably because that was in the tribal territory of Manasseh, his son. And so maybe they were like, Dad's bones should be in our territory.
Yeah, maybe. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. The other thing that we talked about that is really cool. When you talk about, so just so we give background, Joshua's altar is found, you said in Joshua 8.
Yeah, that's where it records.
That altar. And then, but I also mentioned to you about the crossing of the Jordan and the baptism of Jesus.
Right.
And you had stuff to say about that. So
that's a really cool site. And you can go there if you go to Israel. It's called the baptismal site. It used to be closed because it was kind of a military zone, but now it's open, and you can go there. And yeah, what's really cool is that so many things happened. It's a natural crossing place. It's near Jericho. And so this is where the Israelites would have crossed over after the Exodus, and they're finally ready under Joshua's leadership to enter the promised land. And the water stops. It says it stopped upstream at Adam, and we know where that is too.
Yeah.
And so we know where the water stopped, and the Israelites crossed over on dry land. So this is that crossing place. But later on, Elijah and Elisha, when it's time for Elijah to be taken up to heaven, he goes and he keeps trying to leave Elisha behind, and he tries to leave him at Jericho. So we know, like, he's in that area. And then he goes to the Jordan, and so this would be the same place. And he hits it with his tunic, and the waters stop coming, so they cross on dry land. And then he's taken up to heaven in the fiery chariot, and Elisha coming back is able to part the water again to come back. So this is a repeat. This is pulling on the earlier story and saying we see the same power of God that can part the waters here. And then Jesus comes to be baptized, and it's at the same point. And this is where John baptizes Jesus, and the heavens open, and the Spirit comes down like a dove. And so I'm not really superstitious about places, but I think it's really cool that this seems to be a place where God interacts with people, where heaven opens, where Elijah goes up to heaven, where the Holy Spirit comes down. And so, yeah, that's a really cool place, a really, really interesting the way, again and again, we see the same place, and it's important throughout the Bible.
It is. I mean, and I didn't even realize that that's where Elijah was taken to heaven. I had just put together, I wonder where Jesus was baptized, and I wonder how close it was to where they crossed the Jordan. And then I started finding all this information on it. Other people had obviously had the same question, done the research, and put it out there. So very interesting. And you mentioned the city of Adam, and that's a city by the Jordan River, but it was by the first man, Adam and Eve. So when that story that I've heard, and you can tell me, but that when he left the Garden of Eden, that's where he resided, and where he made a city named after himself.
Okay.
And,
I don't know that.
Okay.
I haven't heard that, but what I do know is that it's a place with cliffs there by the edges of the Jordan, and sometimes the edges of the cliff will shear off, and this has actually happened in recorded history, where it's actually stopped up the Jordan River for a while. And so it could be that God, maybe he miraculously just made the water stop, maybe he made the cliff fall in and stop up the water. But yeah, no, I had not heard that it was actually Adam. But in Hebrew, the word Adam, it's the earth. And so if this is a place with cliffs,
like the red clay, right?
Yeah, red clay there. So I don't know, but it could be named after Adam, the first man. Could be named after the dirt that's there. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I think I went to a conference with a man from Israel, and he's actually in Christ Church in Jerusalem.
Okay.
So He's one of the Bible historians,
Mm-hmm.
pastors, but he's a Bible historian, and he studied. His name's Aaron Ime. I talk a lot about him because he actually sparked my interest in all of this.
Okay.
Because I found like he just was giving information and sharing stuff that he had learned as a historian. But he basically studied the 300 years and the writings of 300 years before Jesus and 300 years after Jesus. And some of what he came to learn was even written about Adam and that kind of thing. And so that was a story the way he explained it.
Yeah, that's really cool. I had not heard that before.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. That's why it stuck in my mind, because that's where he moved to when he was forced out of the garden. Okay. And so I thought it was an interesting story. But, it may or may not be 100% true.
Sure.
But maybe it's, been talked about, passed down through the ages, and so people finally just decide it's true. It must be true.
Right.
I'm sure you've heard lots of things like that. So,
yeah.
So you also mentioned to me, as far as your PhD studies, you started hitting a little bit on the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the writings that you found, the little clay tablets. I thought that was pretty interesting as well.
Yeah, so those are really cool. I love reading them. So what they are is these are letters from Canaan, and what we had is they call them city-states. So it's not like there's a king of Canaan. There's a king of Jerusalem and a king of Shechem and a king of Gezer and kings of all of these little city-states. And we read about them even in the account of Joshua, where Joshua is dealing with the kings of all these places. Right. And so we see that connection. But all of these city-state kings are under the authority of Egypt, because Egypt is, it's not part of Egypt, but Egypt controls them and taxes them, and they have to send things to Egypt. And so we have these letters from these city-state kings to the king of Egypt. These were found in Egypt, and what they are letters complaining, saying, there's these people, the Habiru, and they're coming in, these barbarians, these outsiders. They're not us, they're somebody else. They're coming in and they're conquering our cities and they're causing all kinds of trouble. Send archers, or all of the land of the king will be taken by the Habiru. Send archers, send chariots, or all of our cities are lost. And so what I see this is a reference to the Hebrews. The Habiru are the Hebrews in this case. Although the word Habiru it doesn't necessarily mean Hebrew. It means more like nomad or outsider. But that's what the Hebrews were. And even Abraham is described as being a Hebrew. So in that case, Abraham was nomadic. He had flocks and herds. So Abraham was a Hebrew. His descendants are Hebrews. They're Habiru. Right. They fit this description.
Right.
So I see this as the Israelites coming in and starting to conquer these cities and take this land, and the Canaanites are begging Egypt for help, and Egypt doesn't help. Egypt is not strong enough. The Pharaoh, by this point, has lost his slave base. He's lost his army in the Red Sea. He doesn't have anybody to send. He can't help. And so I think that's a really cool connection that we see between the archaeology and ancient texts and then what's written in the Bible, and it just matches up so nicely.
Yeah, because obviously when you're talking about Egypt, you're talking about a place that these same people just left, and all these plagues just came down from God on them, and they were swallowed up by the Red Sea. I mean, all these things were very fresh. They had happened within...
Right. It was 40 years earlier.
40 years,
So, maybe they've had a little bit of time to recover, but not much.
Yeah, because they were devastated. I mean, when you really think about everything that those plagues ruined, I mean, it destroyed crops, animals, all the animals of the field, then not to mention the heirs, half the population in some cases, with the firstborn dying. And so Yeah, I mean, the devastation was huge, and to bounce back from that would have taken decades.
Yeah.
So, yeah, great point. So, yeah, this has been fun, and I'm so glad that you were able to be on and talk. And I know that you said you spend about 6 weeks in Israel every year, and some of the digs.
Yeah, on the Shiloh excavation. So,
Yes.
yeah.
So that's your main site where you're getting paid to work.
Don't get paid to work there, no. But that's my main site. And while I was living in Israel,
you're still working on your PhD. Is that? I mean,
yeah, I'm working on my PhD.
How do archaeologists get paid? By their fines?
The idea, no, because all our fines belong to the Israeli government.
Right.
Archaeology is not lucrative.
Right.
Your best bet is to get a university to fund the excavation. Okay. Associates for Biblical Research is a little different. It's a Christian organization, and so we're funded by donations and contributions from believers who just believe in what we do.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Good to know. All right. Well, yeah. So check out that site, Associates for Biblical Research, and make sure you check out Abigail's sites and links that I'll leave on the show notes. So thank you for being here again.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been fun.